Tēnā koutou katoa, greetings to everyone. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the territory that I'm on and the people whose territory this is and has been, and thank them for their hospitality to us and to me. Thanks also to all the other nations across Canada. I arrived in Vancouver and sort of flew over all of them up to this part. And one of the big differences between Canada and New Zealand, of course, is you can use the plural nations, treaties, whereas I come from the Māori nation of many tribes, one language. Thanks also to the Academy for inviting me here today. So I'm just kind of wanting my PowerPoint to come on, if it's over there somewhere. Do I just click it?
Yeah,
just this one here. Good.
I'll show you, sorry. The little thingy.
Oh, this little thing.
This little thingy.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Yeah.
Just this little green button.
Thank you. I do like the emphasis on solutions, and I did take seriously the instructions to not do too much of the past. But I thank Malcolm for doing that for me, and much of our past is very similar, and actually much of the current health context for Māori, the demographic context for Māori in New Zealand is also very similar. I'm sort of racing ahead. Let me just go back.
The previous one wasn't showing up.
Okay, all right. So what I'm going to do is actually move up and down this PowerPoint to focus on the last 40 years of Māori development, Māori health development in particular. But Māori health development has occurred in a wider context of development. So political development, economic development, educational development, community development, and health development is one part of that. I want to emphasise a point made earlier, that New Zealand and Canada are advanced economies. They're first world countries. On an everyday basis, our two countries are solving incredibly complex problems, and neither of them are very good at solving Indigenous health issues. I see that myself as a matter of choice, not because the problems are not solvable. That our countries have chosen quite purposefully not to solve the problems that our communities face. And for that reason, I think, in our context in New Zealand, there was a tipping point in the 1980s where Māori decided that it wasn't good enough and that we had to step up ourselves and that we had to create the change that we wanted. So early in the 1970s, there's incredible research activism, out of which came a wide range of initiatives. So some of them relate particularly to health, but some are much wider than health. I guess the critical question when we're thinking about solutions is, and the focus on solutions, is to be really clear about what are we trying to solve, not who are we trying to solve, which has been the past. The past has always been about, well, if you fix Indigenous people up, if you change their behaviour, change their language, change their culture, that will solve the Indigenous problem. And the literature is full of that sort of concept of the Indigenous problem. Whereas I think we have to be very clear about defining what is the problem that is being solved. because that then drives the theory and the practice of solutions, and it starts to determine how we think about resources, how we begin to organise, mobilise, and how we understand change. So, when I come to Canada, I'm very conscious of the terms that you use here and the discourse that you use here that we do not use in New Zealand. It's not that one discourse is better than another, it's that discourses frame what is possible and constrain us as well. So in Canada, you're more likely to hear the word reconciliation than you are in New Zealand. And I think it's about thinking about the possibilities of that term. Because to me, what that term implies emphasises something Malcolm said. It implies a sort of generosity of First Nations, Aboriginal peoples in Canada, that to accept the concept of reconciliation is to accept the legitimacy of settlement, the legitimacy of treaties, the legitimacy for Aboriginal peoples of being a minority. And that form of generosity then is a really important concept that has possibilities. And as an optimist, because most Māori in New Zealand are optimistic, I think terms are really important to explore just in terms of what they open up. Right, so what does reconciliation open up? Another term I'm more likely to hear in Canada is the word healing. We sort of skipped over that one very quickly in New Zealand. We use the term treaty settlements, all right? Treaty settlements. And the treaty settlement for us has a concept of reconciliation. We're settling grievances under the treaty, so it also accepts the treaty as legitimate, and therefore the presence of settlers, the descendants of settlers in New Zealand, as legitimate. So then it's a partnership. So we use the word partnership. In Canada, I hear reconciliation, I hear healing. And to me, those are very important concepts, even for us. The concept of healing, especially linked to health. Healing is important. Not just important in a health sense, important in a political sense. And, you know, one of the common phrases that I do hear in both places and in Australia is, you know, Indigenous people need to get over things, move on. Well, you can't get over the kind of trauma that Indigenous peoples have experienced. And you can't move on unless there has been healing, unless there has been reconciliation. So I just want to move through a few examples and then I'm going to skip to some images. I tend to use a PowerPoint mostly for images, so I apologise for all these words. They're mostly for me, not for you. So I think the lessons that I want to pick up on are not necessarily those that are specific to New Zealand. They're ones that I've noticed also in a number of other contexts. And I'm putting them to you as a sort of set of ideas and principles. So how that might work here is your challenge. But I do, I do feel that these ideas are really important if we're going to focus on solutions. So my second point around changing or understanding the discourse is that when we move from a sort of focus on the negatives of colonisation, a focus on the Indigenous problem, to a focus on solutions, we also have to change the language. What does a focus on solutions mean that is different from a focus on the Indigenous problem or the colonial problem? Because it does require a change of mindset to focus on solutions. And for some of us, it requires a leap of imagination to move from where we've been to something that's a little bit more unsettling and uncomfortable. And that leap of imagination is important because you have to imagine that solutions are possible. Not just imagine that they're possible, you have to work as if they are possible. That concept of possibility is in the research that Jeff focused on, because in my communities we tend to think of many of these things as visions. We have a vision of good health, but a vision is like far away over the horizon, as if we don't really believe it's going to happen. It's like a 7-generation vision. Whereas I think what we need to kind of grab hold of is actually it's a possibility. You can change health outcomes. And so by thinking of it as a possibility, I think it brings the time frame in and it starts to put some urgency and reality into the kind of strategies that we use. For many Indigenous communities that I see, when we're talking about health, it's a very difficult concept to think of good health when you live with poor health. Actually, in my own communities, my generation will say things like, we didn't know we were poor when we were growing up because we were all poor. We didn't know we were sick because we were all sick. That's our normal. And so pulling out stories that challenge that normal within our own Indigenous context is really important. And I want to show you a couple of slides. So it's kind of skewed off somewhere there. The old woman in the black and white photo on your left is my great-grandmother. She was full Māori, and she died at the age, people say, of 106. The next woman is my grandmother, and she lived a good life, had 16 children, and died at the age of 99. The next photo has two aunts. The one with her head down, my Auntie Henrietta, is 93. And my mother is in the blue, and she's coming up to 90. And my father will be 90 in January. All the women in my mother's family have lived into their 90s. All the men exited rather early in their 70s for different reasons. War was one of those reasons. So guess what? And then the next photo is the only one I could grab of my daughter and myself. So we're anticipating living quite a long time. But it's also, I guess, a biography that offsets this kind of sense of ill health in Indigenous communities being the normal. Because in the community that I come from, This is not an unusual story, that our women actually lived a long time. And, I grew up hearing people say things, oh, it's because, your grandmother married a white man, a Pākehā man. And I didn't really know what was at the bottom of that kind of story, that somehow the only way we could live a long time is if we intermarried. But when I go back a generation to my great-grandmothers, I had 2 great-grandmothers on this side, they were Māori, and they both lived a long time. So the story we grew up in New Zealand is that Māori people were inherently not well, which is not true. James Cook noticed that when he visited New Zealand, how healthy Māori looked, what great teeth we had, how tall we were, and what a sort of rigorous health kind of lifestyle that people lived. And that story collapsed. It's actually really powerful too. I guess what I'm trying to convey here is if unwellness is the norm, trying to turn that around is a huge challenge. All right, so when we're talking about solutions, we're not talking about just doing a few programs and doing a few projects. It is really trying to turn around this huge mindset, this paradigm of sickness, and a paradigm of believing that Indigenous people are sick. So there's 2 things going on. We believe we don't know we're sick, but we live in communities where we are sick and we think that's normal. All right? But institutions think we're a sick people and treat us like we're a sick people. And as treating us, they think that's normal. So neither set of mythologies are helpful if we're trying to think about solutions. And that's what we have to change. And that requires a number of things happening. I think one of the revolutions that happened in New Zealand in the 70s was a revolution of the mind. It was a revolution of the imagination, because our activists started to promote within our communities that we could stand up, that we could be self-determining, that our treaty could be recognised, that our language was valid, that our knowledge was valid, and that we had a legitimacy to live in New Zealand. And they brought back through, a range of activities that sense of self-belief. Now that then put in place a number of huge sort of moments of change. And if I look at just bring that down through health, very quickly in the 1980s and then into the 1990s, there was this we didn't use the word health sovereignty at the time, but there was this sense that health was something we had a right to, and that, interestingly, that right was embedded in our treaty. Right? So it's kind of to me that's worth thinking about, that our people saw our right to good health as being a treaty right as opposed to a human right, as opposed to a citizenship right. And the fact that I think we saw it as a treaty right is because we'd lost faith that our citizenship rights would be respected, and that we lost faith even that our human rights would be respected. And so all faith went into a recognition of the Treaty of Waitangi. So I was looking last night for a copy of a health declaration that we made in the 90s. So the words aren't important, but it's on the left. And it's the Hangoeka Declaration for Māori Health Research. And this was developed, I think, in 1995 by a small group of us working as researchers in the health area. I had been involved in an asthma project, and I know when I started as a health researcher, we could have had a conference of Māori health research in a telephone booth. That's about how many people we had. By 95, we actually could have it on in a local community marae, and there were about 30 of us. And multidisciplinary, it included our medical researchers, our biomedical researchers, I'm talking about really one person, our health practitioners, and people like me who had a sort of social science background. And so by 95, we as a community were thinking the only way we're going to solve this huge problem in our communities is to try and get control of an agenda. So we started with this sort of sense that unless we could control the agenda for Māori health research, it's just going to be constantly ad hoc, and we're going to spend all our time criticising and critiquing the work of non-Indigenous researchers, getting frustrated, getting angry, and not really wanting to stay in health research as a rewarding career even. So the Hangoeka Declaration was our first shot at Māori health research strategies, about trying to think of what our priorities were, about the capacity that we had to build, but also importantly about how we had to look after each other. Because all of us who had made our way to this gathering were all a little bit scarred. Because when you are the one Indigenous person in a research team, in a department, in an institution, you develop some kind of interesting, gnarly scars. And those wounds wound you. So we arrived thinking the only way we're going to survive is we have to build networks, communities, we have to look after each other. And furthermore, we needed to be healthy ourselves. There's no use going out as health researchers to our communities and everyone's smoking. That's actually been one of the most challenging aspects of our professional practice, is to have our women in particular give up smoking. I didn't smoke in the first place, but I had a few other unhealthy habits. So the reason the sort of controlling the agenda is important is simply because if you don't control it, it controls you. And if it controls you, then you've got a major capacity issue and you can never meet it. You can never meet what needs to be done. And you'll constantly feel and be overwhelmed. And you'll constantly operate in a reactive way and on the whims of whatever crisis is uppermost in the public mind and uppermost in your mind. And we sort of knew as a community that we had to go beyond just thinking about what the latest crisis in Māori health is, and to recognise that we had something much more systemically disturbing, that we had to tackle it strategically, that we had to think about it as a long-term, intergenerational challenge, and we had to get ready for it. And that our generation would not solve it, but that what our generation could do was build the capacity to help solve it. And so that's the kind of stance we took in 1995. And really many of the health initiatives in the Māori area have come about since then. So I know many of you from institutional backgrounds will have some experience of the sort of challenges of engaging Indigenous communities. And that's true in my context and in the institution I work with. I have a couple of mantras that I usually say in my institutional environment. And one is that institutions never remember and communities never forget. And if you think about it in that way, then that's the challenge of building engagement. Institutions never remember and communities never forget. So the challenge of engagement is working across that divide. The other kind of mantra I have when I'm in a really, really bad mood with my institution is that institutions can't care. The people in institutions have to care. I mean, institutions are just, it's like endure. And it's the individuals and the people in the institutions who have to act. That's on my cynical days. But, you know, I guess that the main point I'm trying to say is Indigenous people have to be involved in Indigenous health solutions. Because if they're not, there will be no solution. You cannot force the people into a solution. They have to be involved, and to do that requires engagements and relationships. I think what we've discovered over time is how to draw inspiration from our own knowledge and from our own language and from our own culture. I think that's one of the features, I know many of you have been to New Zealand, that you will see in the Māori health environment is the liberal use of Māori language and Māori concepts. And I'll give you some examples of those later. And to me, one of the strengths of our language is it accesses completely alternative ways of understanding the world. And so it's a resource. I mean, Malcolm talked about indigeneity as a strength. Well, it is a strength, because if the status quo doesn't work, and if everyone is trying to just repeat the same old mistakes, then it's really important to draw on really different understandings and ways of thinking about things. So many of our initiatives are based on Māori models of health, Māori concepts of health, the use of Māori language in health. And, you know, even by using a Māori term, it changes the meaning of health. It moves it away from a focus on dis-ease to a focus on well-being. That reframes what it is we're trying to develop solutions towards. It embeds this kind of sense of the possible, because it's part of the taken for granted ways that we often operate in our communities. So I'll give you some examples shortly of how that works. My next point, and then I'm going to diverge a bit, is the co-production of new knowledge and practices across multiple stakeholders. While I'm saying that Indigenous people need to be involved, we can't actually solve that ourselves. We need you, we need the public, we need a whole lot of other skills. It's a significant, complicated challenge, and it requires significant co-production, bringing together different skills, different disciplines, different ways of thinking, and different kinds of stakeholders. Our best initiatives, our most successful ones, are built on this model of co-production. That's what it's called now. When we were designing these things in the 1990s, it was called being practical and using whatever skills and whoever was available to support to design these initiatives. But it has since become a really important lesson that no one person, none of us, even, Malcolm, trained in his area, I'm trained in sociology. Almost by definition, our disciplines limit us. All right, and I'll just illustrate that with an example. When Indigenous tribes come to my institution, they can never find the front door. And I bet that's true here. Universities don't really have a front door. So when they come with a research problem, which is a great honour for them to actually bring us a research problem, what often happens is they get given this treatment of everyone being polite, nodding, and not having a clue about how to help. So then they get passed to the next person, and then the next person, and then the next person. And it's often seen as their problem, they're not articulating the problem, all right? Whereas they're thinking, academics in this case, are idiots and don't listen. Because what they're bringing us is a kind of a way of articulating what they're worried about that actually requires all our disciplines to be in the same room together. Because we've got to learn to talk to each other. We've got to learn to work with each other because they need actually a complex configuration of skills that not one of us has by ourselves. So that can be amusing for a little while as I kind of think about some of the great examples of miscommunication that I've witnessed over the years in the two universities I've worked in, where actually tribes and communities have sought research and they've come with a question. And it might be a question like, how can you help us prevent suicide in our communities? Right, that's the question. So everyone thinks, oh, we'll get a suicide researcher. But that's not actually the question they're asking. They don't want just a suicide researcher. They're wanting a group of researchers who can work with their whole community to redesign the conditions of that community, to provide hope for that community, to provide pathways to employment for that community, to provide healing and trauma counselling for that community. At the same time, clean up the river, provide good nutrition, help with leadership, put in place some business skills. They don't want a single suicide researcher. In fact, on this particular example I'm giving, is they completely rejected having a suicide researcher because they thought the more that researcher asked questions, the worse the problem would become. So they went away dissatisfied. And our committee sat around there, a table, scratching our heads. Well, I wasn't scratching my head, I was kind of smiling, thinking, this is a good problem for us to have, But we need to commit to kind of solving this problem, to thinking about it as an institution. And it became really obvious, for us at that time, that universities I'm talking about are hopeless at collaborating internally. They're pathetic. There's some individuals who are good, but as a culture at that time, and probably also now, it was very difficult to quickly mobilise into collaborations across the different cultures of different disciplines in different faculties. That was required a complete change of mindset, and then how we mobilised the kind of resources to do that. We're still struggling in that space. My current institution, in terms of trying to deal with the front door issue that helps broker information for our tribes, we've established a whole new research institute to do that, and to just kind of be the front door. They're not the institution that will necessarily do the research or lead the research, but they're the group who provide that initial assessment of how can we meet your needs, how can we assemble the right team, who are the people that we can put in front of you so you don't get frustrated and walk away and think that we're idiots, and that we think that we can actually do something for you. All right, so that was that example. I now want to just move a little bit. Okay, so here are 4 slides that tell a story. An interesting story at one for me personally, because it's from my tribe. So the little boy on the left, that slide there is basically to emphasise the worldview that we bring, and that, researchers are good at looking at us, but we look at researchers too. All right, we're summing researchers up. We're analysing them, and they're often coming up short. We analyse their ethics, we analyse their presentation, we think about the questions they ask in terms of why do they want to know that stuff for? What is it they're trying to find out? And there's a position that we take in that, the sort of we're looking at you, looking at us, we're looking at you sort of approach. But it's actually an important position to take in an Indigenous community. It's better than lying down and saying, oh, come, walk all over us, which is a passive approach to research. This is a negotiated approach to research. When you come into our communities, you've got to look at us, you've got to engage with us, you've got to negotiate with us. Then we might find some good questions. The second slide there is just a carving, has 3 baskets of knowledge. So for Māori people, all the early ethnographers talk about our stories of knowledge, that we had very powerful stories of the significance of knowledge, that humans were given knowledge, and that with that knowledge came responsibility. And the knowledge was classified into 3 baskets. Knowledge, which was, we needed that just to live an ordinary life. Knowledge, the second knowledge was special and sacred. And the third knowledge was that human beings also got the knowledge to basically destroy themselves. So the sort of dangerous knowledge that needed to be protected. So we had theories of knowledge, and all cultures do. But, as Malcolm emphasised, that's a lot of what got destroyed through schooling. These kind of understandings that we had of, how knowledge worked, and that we valued knowledge, and that we had practices for the storage of knowledge. So people tend to think, oh, you're an oral culture, and that means you must have good memories, because you don't have a text to store knowledge. Well, actually, we had lots of different ways to store knowledge, but our views and worldviews are so different, you wouldn't understand if I said, well, we're going to store knowledge in that rock over there. We're going to store knowledge temporarily in a tree trunk. We might store knowledge over here in that bird, and that when that bird is ready to give it back to us, that bird will deliver. That we had kind of strategies for thinking about how we could store or archive knowledge. Mostly it was stored in our carvings and in our oral discourses. It was part and parcel of our practices, right? That knowledge is also a sort of ontology. It's a practice that we had. So the reason those stories are important, or that kind of idea of knowledge is important, is because now we rely on that, what we call mātauranga, to inform pretty much all government-funded research in New Zealand. Has to include statements about the inclusion of Māori knowledge. Right? It's in the Health Research Council funding, it's in the Marsden Council funding, and it's in the Ministry of Business Economic Development funding. It's called Vision Mātauranga. I'll show you the policy. The third slide tells us something about reconciliation and treaty settlements. And it tells us that actually history can be reconciled, that you can change something that happened in the past, because a lot of people don't think you can. So this is an image at the back through the gateway of a very old meeting house that is now standing up in my community. It was taken more than 100 years ago by the government. It went on a world tour. It was displayed at different world exhibitions. It was dismantled, turned inside out, turned upside down. Eventually the Otago Museum got it and refused to give it back to our tribe. We had to use this as part of our claim for our tribunal setting. The museum people said, no, you cannot give this precious meeting house back to them, to those people, because what will they do with it? They don't have conservators to look after it. And of course, the negotiators said to the tribe, which was led by my father at the time, so what will you do with this old, precious meeting house that has been well cared for and conserved in a top museum in New Zealand? What will you do with it? And our tribe answered, well, we're going to use it. What do you think we will do with it? We're not going to display it. We will use it for what it was built for. The negotiations took 10 years. It eventually came back. It is now part of a very modern complex. It is a beautiful meeting house, and it's open to the public. So it's changed what it was originally used for, but it is now here. People thought it was impossible to get it back. They thought it was impossible to change this course of history. we have many examples which say, actually you can change it. You just have to have a long-term view and go after it. The final slide there is of one of the many built-for-purpose institutions that Māori have established in New Zealand. And the point I want to make about this, it is in my general points, is when we're trying to kind of move from one paradigm to another in systems, we tend to keep the same infrastructure. It's like, okay, change a policy. Same people, same organisational structure. You might do a restructure, collapse departments, put in new place departments, but essentially the same institutions. What we've done in our own communities is built new, modern organisations that help us do what we're trying to do in our development. We have hauora, which are Māori health providers. They contract to government. It's one of the opportunities of neoliberalism that occurred in the 90s, is that our organisations could contract to provide government services. But our communities developed these organisations, and many of them are very, very robust and have a high level of integrity. Some have failed. The contracting environment, as you would know, is a tough regime. So it is dynamic, not just in the Māori sector, but across the board. But our very best organisations are very robust and very competitive with other organisations. The one in this slide is one of 3 Māori universities. We're not allowed to call them universities because the universities of New Zealand own the legal name university. So we call it, or Graham, my husband, has called it the Indigenous-University, which is a whole new word to get around this particular legal ownership that institutions have, which illustrates my point that many of the existing institutions are incredibly privileged and continue to just perpetuate themselves and don't change. What we've done is tried to build new, fit-for-purpose organisations. What we don't see is the Crown or the government doing the same. What we see them doing is just change a policy every 3 years, new government, change the policy again, go round and round in circles. They never change the capability, right? Never change the capability of those organisations. That goes up and down. All right, so just kind of moving down, I'm about halfway through this slide, but I know time is tight, so I'm going to finish soon and just kind of may not get to discuss some of these other things. So the next point I want to pick up on is really moving beyond the sort of short-term, what I call programmatic and incremental change approaches, to an intergenerational and community paradigmatic approaches. And so what do I mean by that? I think in the sort of old way of doing things, everyone in my community is on a program. All right, if you're having a baby, you're on a special program. If you had the baby, you're on a special program. The baby's on a program. The toddler's on a program. You go to school, you're on a literacy program. You leave school, you're on a pre-employment program. You have a baby, you're on another program. All right? You can't. Who can survive that? You're just like waiting for the next program. Because I'm like, what's my program? I'm going to retire soon. So I'll go to a retirement program. That sort of approach to Indigenous development it sucks. Sorry. It's sort of an example of short-term, well-intentioned, politically often seen as, well, we're doing something, but it doesn't focus on system change, doesn't focus on building capability, and more importantly, it doesn't join the programs. So, you're on one program, you finish the program, you fall down a cliff. They find you at the bottom of the cliff, they put you on a new program. They take you up to the top of the cliff. You finish that program, you fall down the cliff again. Many of them are not joined up. All right, they're not joined up because these programs are health ones, these are justice ones, these are education ones, these are community development ones, these are special Prime Minister's projects ones. The sort of lack of connectivity of the system. So then everyone in the public is going, look at all the money they're spending on Indigenous people. There's a lot of money, which is true. But don't blame us for not smart spending, all right? Because that's what has happened in our context. Yeah, spent a lot of money on a lot of dumb things. Spent a lot of money not joining things up so that they don't make a difference. They don't build. They don't kind of amount to anything. They don't build momentum. So that sort of approach, I think, has to change if you move into solutions. Because solutions focus, to me, is not lots of programs. A solution focus has to be more strategic, and it has to have the sense that it is long-term. It is intergenerational. It is going to take more than one generation. And it's a paradigm change, all right? It has to be informed. To me, that's what evidence-based policy should be doing. It's a kind of informed, paradigmatic approaches that are solution-focused. I'm one of the ones who are quite cynical about evidence-based policies, and I'll give you a good example why. So on the bottom left, you may not see his face, Dr. David Tipene Leach, he's my generation. He was the only Māori at medical school when I was at university. He's been involved in the SIDS area for decades. And he's designed this intervention. He went back to his tribe, designed an intervention, did the evaluations, wrote them up, published them, went to the Ministry of Health and suggested these little baby pods. They're kind of traditionally woven baby pods that you can put the baby in like a bassinet, but the pod can then be on the bed. So it was a way of trying to, create the behavioural change of mothers sleeping with their babies by creating this woven baby pod. Much of all his evaluations showed it was a very effective intervention, the great take-up, big community project, because the women who were weavers in the community wove these. Then the women decided, well, no, we're not going to weave them for the mothers. We're going to teach the mothers to weave their own. And then they will value that and they'll get some knowledge about their identity at the same time. Went to the Ministry of Health. Ministry of Health wouldn't fund it. All right? So that's not about a lack of evidence. That's about a lack of will. Then there was a public outcry, and about a month ago, there were some mealy-mouthed statements saying, we will be funding these baby pods. So to me, evidence-based policy occurs in a politics. And it's not just about evidence informing policy, it's what evidence counts in informing policy. Another example of this is what's called social bonds, which fits in under the sort of privatisation agenda, which our government wants to implement. And there's absolutely no evidence anywhere in the world that this works at all. All right? But that's going to be a program, because a government that's in power does not need evidence to implement policy. Evidence-based policy also fits within a power relation. All right, time's up, and I'll just stop. Thank you.
Hello, I'm John Cairns from UBC and a past president of CAHS. Thank you, Dr. Smith, for your very stimulating comments. The focus of this forum is on what works and why, and your title was Solutions. And I think many of us have a sense that perhaps in a number of ways New Zealand may be ahead of Canada in dealing with some of these issues that both countries face. So I guess first question is, do you feel that you have implemented some solutions in New Zealand that perhaps we could learn from? And then second, assuming that perhaps you have, are the outcomes better? In other words, are the various metrics of Aboriginal health better in New Zealand than they are in Canada?
Just imagine the iceberg image. Much of what we've been establishing is what sits under the surface. When you're talking about capacity building, changing systems, that's the sort of fundamental changes that have to occur underneath the system in order to get the actual solutions that you want on the top of the iceberg that you can see. Interestingly, there are two reports that have come out recently. One from actually the Irupōmare Centre up there on the right, who've been doing regular Māori health status reports. And I think there was this kind of hint that outcomes for Māori are improving, in particular areas in the kind of neonatal and then in the early childhood area. What does that mean? I think two things. It means they're better at getting the right kind of data anyway and understanding that. It also means that broader improvements in Māori life, like insulating homes, is also improving the situation. Simultaneously, however, there's a report from my mum's tribe which says that we have the worst outcomes in New Zealand in our tribe, which is really depressing. So are things changing? I think they are, and I think they will continue to improve. But I think, I guess what I was trying to say with this intergenerational work that has to be done, just to build under the iceberg, has taken 30 years. That's how long it takes. It takes a generation. It actually takes more than one generation. I think it'll take about 3, possibly 7 generations. You have the concept here of 7. It's interesting, isn't it? Because you can wipe some things out in a generation, but to rebuild them takes more than a generation.
Thank you. Yes.
Ronaldo Batista, I'm Scientific Director of the Fonds de Recherche du Québec Santé. Thank you also for a very inspiring talk. You referred to 3 levels of knowledge, and I was wondering how you integrate sacred and spiritual knowledge in health research and in healing practices.
Good question. It requires a number of processes. So firstly, what is sacred knowledge? all right? So the reason I asked that question is that we also have to be very critical about what's defined as sacred knowledge now compared to what was sacred knowledge 100 years ago. And the reason it's critical is if I put my woman's hat on, you know, some people will say those who are our current experts in sacred knowledge, they just all happen to be men, which is not true. They just happen to consult men who then say this is what sacred knowledge is. So it's been sort of gendered. It's been through a sort of colonial process sometimes. It's been kept secret in families. It's been submerged. So we've got, you know, over the last few years, we've had our own sort of internal interrogation of what do we mean by sacred knowledge, because often what we mean is restricted or limited knowledge. It's not sacred in that secret sense, because all knowledge is sacred, actually, even scientific knowledge. It's sacred for as long as it's valid. And then it's really sacred when we put it in an archive, because we think, oh, that's really special knowledge. So I guess what I'm doing is deconstructing your question before we can answer the question. So having sort of thought about what do we really mean by Indigenous knowledge, and to what extent do these concepts of the sacred, which is usually put in opposition to anthropologically to the profane or to the ordinary, to what extent are those simply categories that we have come to reproduce when we talk about our own knowledge, as opposed to, you know, an Indigenous concept, which is actually all knowledge is sacred and some knowledge is restricted. And if we think about it in that sort of pragmatic sense, and I'm just talking about our own people, then it's understanding what were those restrictions about, and to what extent are those restrictions kind of valid in the particular projects. So I'll just give you a quick example. I've been part of a project working with Indigenous knowledge specialists and scientists, trying to have difficult conversations about new biotechnologies. And our first conversation was around reproductive technologies. That was a good, easy, difficult subject. Easy because Māori have a lot of concepts about the sacredness or tapuness of life. So very, you know, and very common sort of knowledge in our communities about what that means. So then talking about reproductive technologies means that they could come to that discussion with a deep philosophical kind of notion of what they were going to talk about. And then the scientists could talk about all the flash technologies and all the ethical issues that are involved. In that sort of cross-cultural exchange, you don't know what is sacred often until you're pushed into a level of having to think, oh my God, no, I'm not going to tell you that. Or, you know, we're getting into a zone which I think is well beyond what we can talk about here. We're going to have to do something else. We're going to have to introduce a set of ceremonies for the purpose of talking about this sacred subject. So the answer to your question is not a simple answer. It's actually a complex answer, but it can be answered through processes and thinking through what the question is asking of us.